Hello and welcome to our discussion hosted by the Council for Global Cooperation. And today's discussion titles War in Ukraine, the Question of Genocide. I am Somava Basu, President and founder of the Council for Global Cooperation, CGC, and I want to thank you all for joining us for the important discussion. Today, as we know, marks the unfortunate one-year anniversary of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. The war in Ukraine had started since 2014 with the rise of the Maidan Revolution and the Russian annexation of Crimea. But 24 February 2022 was a day when the world witnessed a great catastrophe with the Russian invasion escalating and resulting in destruction of cities, massive death tolls, threat of expansion, refugee crisis, and finally, with a concern that is often ignored and neglected, the threat of mass murders and crimes against humanity. 70 years ago, the UN Genocide Convention was born with a promise never again to ensure that no one in the world faces genocides and horrors of Nazi Holocaust ever again. But history has never been kind. With new atrocities, the promise is never fulfilled. The question of genocide has time and again came up in different forms. Experts today present in our panel knows better than me that how difficult the process is to prove a genocide and punishing the perpetrators. Similarly, probably we will never know, at least not sooner, what's happening in Ukraine and what should we call it. As human beings, we can only hope for the best. And in today's session, when we aim to analyze the nature of atrocities and war crimes and speak on genocide and genocidal crimes going in Ukraine, I just hope the situations are not as worse as we fear or assume. CGC's hurt lies with the families and victims who lost their lives or are suffering as a result of this war on both sides, whether it is the Ukrainian or the Russian. Before we begin with today's session, I would like to briefly introduce our speakers. Today, we have the distinct honor to have with us Professor Norman Naimark. Professor Naimark is the Robert and Florence McDonnell Professor of Eastern European Studies at Stanford University and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He is an expert on Eastern Europe and specializes in Cold War and genocide studies. He is a distinguished scholar who was awarded Distinguished Service Cross from the government of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1996. His publications include Stalin and the Fate of Europe, the post-war struggle for sovereignty, Genocide of World History, Stalin's Genocides, and many others. We also have the honor to have with us Professor David Marples. Professor Marples is a distinguished university professor of Russian and East European history at University of Alberta. He specializes in history and contemporary politics of Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. He is the author of 16 single-authored books, including Understanding Ukraine and Belarus, Ukrainian Conflict, Our Glorious Past, Lukashenko's Belarus, and the Great Patriotic War, among others. He has been the president of the North American Association for Belarusian Studies. I warmly welcome both Professor Norman Naimark and David Marples to our session. Today, we would also have with us Ambassador Charles Crawford. Charles Crawford is a former British diplomat, non-practicing barrister, communications consultant, and writer. He has served as ambassador to Sarajevo, Belgrade, and Warsaw. Today, he would be joining us for commentary after the session and would also discuss his views on genocides and about the genocides in Eastern Europe, which occurred during his diplomatic career and which he would like to share a few views and also speak with the speakers. So Yeah, so audiences are encouraged to drop their questions in the chat box, and we would like to cover them as much as our time permits. And so today we will start with our session. And so without further delays, and I would like to pass on the floor to Professor Norman Naimark. The virtual floor is yours, Professor Naimark. Over to you.
Okay, Sumava, thank you very much for the invitation. This is, as you noted, an auspicious day, 1 year after the February 24th invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I confess I was one of those who didn't think this would ever happen, and I didn't think it would happen, even though American intelligence was telling us that the Russian troops were massing on the Ukrainian border. I didn't think it would happen because I didn't think it was in the interests of Russia. And I still don't think it's in the interests of Russia. The war has proven to be a catastrophe in many different ways. First of all, obviously for the Ukrainians, the infrastructure has been destroyed. We don't know exactly how many casualties there have been at war, or even the civilian casualties. It's hard to even estimate 50, 60,000 altogether dead and wounded. A kind of terrible destruction of their economy. I mean, we sometimes underestimate how badly the Ukrainian economy has been hit by this war, thinking about our economies and European economies and Russian economies because of the sanctions. Russia, too, has suffered. I mean, the casualties here, again, it's hard to know exactly what the casualty rates are. Some people I heard just yesterday at a session say 200,000, dead and wounded. It could be that high. The prospects, of Russian peace and social peace and sense of place in the world, has been, in my view, destroyed by this war. The relations with the West, are really gone for probably a decade, if not more. So it's been, in some senses, a terrible tragedy for Russia, too. And for Russian liberals, we know nearly 500,000 Russians have left Russia, and this is, a talented brain drain. Of course, one of the things that's come out of the war is that Ukraine has emerged spiritually and morally enriched by the unity and sense of purpose that Ukrainians have shown in this struggle. Meanwhile, I think on the other side, the Russians have gotten nothing from a kind of cynical defense of an unjust invasion. This is also the 90th anniversary of the Holodomor, the killer famine of 1932-33. And if we take ourselves back exactly 90 years to Ukraine, let's say February of 1933, the area of Ukraine and northern Kuban inhabited by Ukrainians was, as my colleague here at the Hoover, now deceased, Robert Conquest, said, one vast Belsen. And by that, he meant that bodies were strewn across the countryside. People were too weak, to bury their loved ones and friends. It was a scene, much as in concentration camps, of people who couldn't move, couldn't help themselves, and couldn't help others because of this terrible famine. The best estimates of that famine are that roughly 4 million people died, although there have been now estimates coming out of Ukraine that there are many more who were killed in that famine, 10.5 million. But it seems to me that this work that's done by Oleg Bolovina, at the University of North Carolina, Ukrainian-American demographer, establishes this 4 million figure as being pretty accurate. So I want to make four basic observations about these two sets of events divided by 90 years. You know, the war in Ukraine today and the Holodomor then. First of all, dealing with this history and memory of Holodomor is extremely important in understanding the events today. And even looking, I mean, history is one of those things that teaches us, it's a conversation between present and past. And the present in some ways teaches us about the past, and the past certainly teaches us about the present. And so this is an enterprise, I think, of great importance. We know a lot more about the Holodomor now since the turn of the century, especially since the Orange Revolution. And one can even say, since Maidan, that it was a murderous, genocidal attack on the Ukrainian people by the Soviet government, and on not just on Ukrainian peasants who died in huge numbers, but also on the Ukrainian intelligentsia, the Ukrainian church, its priests, and as I said, on the Ukrainian people as a whole. This attack inevitably has had a serious traumatic imprint, on the development of Ukraine and Ukrainians. I mean, we know from studies of the Holocaust and Holocaust survivors, and even of Armenians, and now we're talking about a genocide that occurred, in 1915, 1916, in the case of the Armenians, that there is serious intergenerational trauma that occurs in people as a result, among peoples as a result of genocide. So it's extremely important that Ukrainians engage, in an interrogation of what happened then and now, that we engage in that same interrogation, and indeed that the international community of scholars look at what happened. Since February 24th, the trauma of the Holodomor has been compounded by what I think is another genocidal attack on Ukrainian national existence, and that is this unprovoked invasion by the armed forces of the Russian Federation. We don't know how this war is going to end, and when it will end. I mean, it could go on for an extremely long time. And I think we probably have to take that into consideration. The repressions, the murder, the atrocities that are occurring in the Russian occupied zones of Ukraine are something we have heard about and we know about. People are collecting information about. But unlike the Holodomor, the history of this contemporary war is very hard to write now. We do know that much of the same kind of eliminatory violence is already traumatizing. Large segments of the population have had to endure firsthand killing, beating, torture, and a variety of crimes, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Genocide is hard at the moment, in my view, to judge. So I call it a genocidal attack because it's like genocide, but without, a kind of final disposition of the evidence, a way of kind of wrapping up the situation. It's hard to say that, genocide is going on. But nevertheless, this attack is genocidal, meaning it has the characteristics, many of the characteristics of what we consider to be genocide. So in some sense, says the Russians have inflicted a double trauma on the Ukrainians, the trauma, of attacking them physically and doing them harm, but also the trauma of genocide, which is the attempt to eliminate them as a nation. In other words, to eliminate them and their ability to function as a united whole. And in both cases, by the way, we have Stalin in the 1930s and we have Putin now. They're growing more and more similar. We can talk about that more if you would like. But it seems to me Putin is moving more and more in the direction of a kind of Stalin-like visage that threatens, as I say, the physical existence of Ukrainians and their very idea of self. One of the offshoots, of this entire affair is that Ukrainians have held up remarkably well. I mean, they, just as the Russians are attacking their identity and their sense of self and distinctiveness, it's growing in its power and its significance. In other words, in good measure, Ukrainian identity and nationality, has been strengthened by this war. And it's been strengthened in irreversible ways. In other words, nation building is always a process that, proceeds in different stages and in different ways. And this stage of nation building in Ukraine, what's happened since last February 24th, has been quite extraordinary. And I think all Ukrainians will tell you the same thing. And even those, who felt hybrid Russian or felt mixed, emotions about Ukraine versus Russia, that's all changed now. In some senses, the war has created a new Ukraine. They understand there are many reasons that there are many reasons that the Ukrainians fight so hard, but I would suggest to you that one of them, consciously or subconsciously, is what happened during the Holodomor. In other words, they see in places like Bucha and Izium and Mariupol and other places, they see what happened in 1932-33, and they tell themselves it's happening again, that their very existence again is in jeopardy, and that the Russians, are attacking them once again. And this becomes then a kind of narrative of nationality that, there is this ongoing and now centuries long, some will even assert centuries long attack on Ukrainians by the Russians. Okay, so that's the first sort of set of observations I'd like to make. The second set of observations really has to do with more specifically about the violence itself and the terror and the torture, which it's important to note is part of genocide everywhere. There is no genocide in some ways without torture and terror at the same time. There are several aspects to this particular observation. The first is the readiness of the Soviets in the early 1930s and now the Russian perpetrators to terrorize the Ukrainian population and to use torture to, in the case of 32-33, extract grain from peasants and beat confessions from alleged enemies. And now you have the same thing going on. One can easily hypothesize a strong connection between the OGPU and NKVD torturers of the 1930s and those now. These continuities, by the way, again, are growing stronger. As I mentioned, it's been argued in the reporting of a very fine Russian investigative journalist, a man named Andrei Soldatov, who's a Russian expert on the FSB, that the actual precursors of the FSB these days is not the KGB. The FSB, by the way, is the Russian secret service and the political police. It's not the old KGB, which we knew in the Cold War period, but the NKVD. In other words, that its control of Russian society and even its control of the war in Ukraine has become so powerful that it is engaging in the kinds of activities that the old NKVD did. And the old NKVD really infiltrated everything. Everybody used torture, reporting, spies to further Russian interests or Moscow's interests. I mean, all one has to do is read Lynn Viola's book on Stalin's perpetrators on trial, and then a book by Stanislav Aseev called The Torture Camp, which is about the torture of Ukrainians by Russians, to conclude that very little has changed in the methods and the brutality involved. The beatings, the electric shocks, the violations of the human body in the most inhumane ways, and various forms of what we call now waterboarding, and perfunctory and non-judicial murder. In other words, part of this business of torture is also, as I said, a murder. Aseev observes that many of the torturers, in his case, were sadists and misanthropes. And I think that these kinds of observations on his part, have been held up by what we have heard about the many instances where Ukrainians in the occupied territories have been badly abused. And the torturers only get more brutal as time goes on, and the violations of human rights only get more brutal. There is no pity or empathy on the part of the Russian occupiers for the Ukrainians under their control. And again, this goes to the very top. In the case of 1932-33, it was Joseph Stalin who couldn't have given a whit about the fact that the Ukrainian countryside was in such horrible condition, and now is the same for Putin, who seems to only take pleasure in the difficulties of the Ukrainians. In fact, one of the saddest observations I would make about my own study in comparative genocide is that gratuitous violence of the sort that the Ukrainians are subjected to now and in the Holodomor remain at the heart of the genocidal enterprise. In other words, you just simply don't care about the victim because the victim has been so badly abused. On one level, the violence is strategic, meaning it's planned and it's part of the goal of the of the occupiers, in this case of the Russian aggressors. On the other hand, it's completely unnecessary in a war or in an occupation, or for that matter, in grain requisitioning in 1932-33. Ukrainians, we know, were sent off to bitter exile and a terrible fate in the Gulag in 1932-33. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians perished in the Gulag, before and after the Holodomor. Now they're removed, to very dangerous filtration camps and uncertain fates in Russian prisons and work camps in the far reaches of the Russian Federation. And these filtration camps, by the way, are very much modeled on the World War II NKVD camps and Smersh camps, which were used, to also find spies. In other words, to hire, to find agents to move back into Ukraine, in this case, today, to accomplish the Russians' end. Terror, torture, and genocide are made possible through the processes of dehumanization. And, I don't want to go into huge detail here. We all know about that. A young colleague of mine here at Stanford, a woman named Rhiannon Nielsen, has called it toxification of fellow human beings. She likes that better because what it means is that human beings become not just dehumanized, but they become dangerous. In other words, they are dangerous to the Russian body politic. We know Ukrainians in 32-33, were treated in that fashion. They were called vermin, and spiders and apes and all kinds of dehumanizing language, but they were also treated, and Stalin treated them as dangerous to the Soviet Union. And as a result, there was no reason not to eliminate them. They were infectious and threatening. And that goes for today too, where Ukrainians are seen as threatening the very existence of the Russian Federation. And Putin claims that the war is a defensive war, one where the United States and the West is using the Ukrainian elite to capture the Ukrainian people, to undermine the Russian Federation, and that Ukrainian national feeling is essentially dangerous to Russia. How could Soviet communist idealists, one thinks of the later dissident Lev Kopelev, do what they did to innocent Ukrainian farmers during the Holodomor? Well, part of the answer is ideology, of course, but part of the answer is this dehumanizing of victims, this making the people less than you, and doing that in a kind of comprehensive way. How do young Russian soldiers shoot down in the streets of Bucha, Ukrainians riding bicycles to pick up groceries? I mean, how does that happen? Well, the reason it happens in part is this dehumanization. And in this case, as you know, it's this Nazi business, neo-Nazis. And, that's all the Ukrainians are called. I watch Russian late night television, and they're constantly talking about Nazis. I mean, terror and torture cannot be understood separately from the sexual violence that infuses genocidal situations. And like torture itself, it's both strategic and totally unnecessary. We know a lot more about the sexual violence that's going on in Ukraine now, and it's quite widespread. And by the way, sexual violence has become part of our understanding of what genocide is all about. I mean, through Bosnia and through Rwanda, the courts have decided, that systematic mass rape is genocide. I mean, it's not just a characteristic of genocide; it is genocide. And so, we're keeping careful eye out on this, although, again, it's hard to document. And 32, 33, it's even harder to document. People just didn't talk about it. They just couldn't talk about it. And Oksana Kish, who's done some very nice work about women in the Holodomor, has said, she cited several cases of sexual violence, but that's all she could really come up with. And she said, people just wouldn't talk about it. And other things were on their mind to talk about. They talked about trying to save their kids and that kind of thing, but they did anything to save their kids. And there are instances of sexual violence there. Okay, the third observation I make, I have to do this very quickly, is that the Holodomor and present atrocities in Ukraine are characterized by denial. Comparative genocide studies make clear that denial is built into the very fabric of genocide. It happens when genocide takes place. I mean, this is, this happened in the Armenian genocide, it happened in the Holocaust. I mean, it happened in Bosnia, it happened in Rwanda, where people say, no, there is no genocide going on. And of course, this is what Putin is saying too. And not only that, he's trying to turn the tables on the Ukrainians, say, no, it's Ukrainians who are committing genocide against innocent Russians in the Donbass. So we have complete denial on the part of the Russians. We also have denial about the Holodomor, as you know. At the time, Stalin said there is no famine. And would not allow any famine relief into the Soviet Union, in contrast, by the way, to the early 1920s, when famine relief was allowed into the Soviet Union. That denial continues to this day. As we know, Russian scholars and Russians will say, there was famine all over the Soviet Union, and what happened in Ukraine was not unusual. That's simply, I think, wrong-headed and has been disproven by a number of scholars. And there was famine all over the Soviet Union, but the Ukrainian famine was used in a particular way by Stalin, to break the back of the Ukrainian peasantry. So this business of denial, as I said, I watch these programs every night on Russian television, which is hard to do. And my wife, who also knows Russian, sort of screams in the background, but she can't stand to listen to what they're saying. And I understand that, because they are accusing the Ukrainians of all of the crimes that they're doing. So let me leave this quickly and turn to a fourth question. That is the importance that Ukrainian and Western allies have attached to getting the message about a genocide out to the public in accessible forms. so that the public can understand, what's going on. And we've heard now, the Ukrainian prosecutor general has been keeping track of war crimes in Ukraine. There are 4 kinds of atrocity crimes. Maybe we should mention this very briefly: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression. Well, in the case of war crimes, the prosecutor general has identified 65,000 cases of war crimes. The Ukrainians are really following this very closely, and they're being very systematic, as is, by the way, the State Department, about dealing with war crimes. The Vice President of the United States on February 1st, 2023, at the Munich Security Conference said, the Russians have committed crimes against humanity, and we've collected them in material, and we can prove it. And that's very important. Crimes against humanity and war crimes, sometimes they overlap, sometimes they're different. But the point is, these crimes, these atrocity crimes, which the Russians are liable for, to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and the International Criminal Court. I've talked to them in sort of briefing sessions about history, not about criminal stuff, but about history, and they're collecting. There's a whole team of people, 25, 30 people who are working on this right now, and they're collecting material to try to bring, eventually the perpetrators to court. Then there's the question of genocide. And as I've mentioned, that's a difficult question. And the International Criminal Court also has jurisdiction over genocide. And it is collecting material, and it will, I think, one day come in with an indictment for genocide against Putin and the Russian leadership. Again, we need a lot more information about the intentionality. As you know, genocide, roughly defined, is the intention to destroy all or part of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, as such. In other words, you're destroying the group as such. Is that what the Russians are trying to do? Well, we need more evidence, it seems to me, to be able to come up with that. And I suspect that they will find that evidence, and that, that one day we may have these trials. No day soon. I may not see it. But remember, Milosevic came to trial very late. In the Bosnian case, Nazis are still being tried in Germany. They just tried a 98-year-old woman in Germany. So there's no statute of limitations on genocide, and the result is this may happen in the distant future. And the final crime, the crime of war of aggression, which the Russians have clearly committed. I think there's no doubt in anybody's mind that they've committed aggression. They've got to admit themselves that they committed aggression against Ukraine. Is not under the ICC's jurisdiction for a variety of reasons, and having to do with the Russians not being party to the Treaty of Rome in 1998. And instead, what's happening, and I just signed a petition inaugurated by a couple of Ukrainian former American ambassadors to Ukraine, actually, Taylor, I'm forgetting the other guy's name, but a petition to the General Assembly, to Antony Blinken, our Secretary of State, to bring to the General Assembly of the United Nations the request to try Russians for the crime of aggression. It's not impossible, to form a special tribunal. And this is what, by the way, the government in Kiev is asking for too, a special tribunal to try Russians for the war of aggression, because it's quite clear they committed a war of aggression. By the way, that was the crime for which the Nazis were tried at Nuremberg, the war of aggression. They weren't tried for genocide; they were tried for war of aggression and hanged for that crime. Okay, so maybe I've used up my half an hour. I've made my observations. Let me just say That's what's going on today in Ukraine. And we can see the way it's being documented, the way it has been publicized, the way the international community is taking cognizance of what happened is so much more pervasive and important and part of our international consciousness than was Holodomor in 32-33, where there were concrete attempts to cover it up, not just by the perpetrators, but by Westerners who were in the Soviet Union at the time. I mean, we all know these stories of the Westerners who went there and famous Pulitzer Prize New York Times columnist Walter Duranty, who said there is no famine and there's nothing going on and there people aren't dying and it's just normal hunger that's going on all over. So we have a whole different sort of set, an interesting new set of norms, criteria, international conversations that are going on about this genocidal situation now than went on about the famine in 32-33. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Professor Naimark. It was a really wonderful explanation, and your insights were really important, because as a kid of 21st century, even I never imagined that, Ukraine, we have read about Holodomor, we have read about Ukrainian sufferings in World War times and later in the Soviet Union, but we never imagined that we have to see in 21st century something, a repeat of history. History has indeed, a nasty habit of repeating itself. And yeah, I would like to definitely talk regarding this in our discussion after our session in the discussion time. And I hope audiences also have questions for our speakers. So yes, so I would like to, without further delays, I would like to pass on the floor to our second speaker, Professor David Marples. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Sumava, and it's a pleasure to be taking part in this panel. I would like to start by sharing my screen because I made a few slides to go with my talk. So I go to the beginning. Okay, so my title is Russia's Denial of Ukrainian Identity in the War of 2014-23. Some of what I say may repeat what Norman said. I don't think a lot, but I think some of them, some parts of it definitely will. But that's just goes with the territory, I think. So I'd like to begin by defining genocide, insofar as we know what genocide is. And Norman has described the first one already, a crime committed with the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group in whole or in part. The 1948 definition of Raphael Lemkin omits cultural genocide, and it also omits political groups, the destruction of political groups. So the genocides that are most familiar are the Holocaust of the Jews during the Second World War, the destruction of Armenians in 1915. And I see Jay Winters in the audience. He knows far more about that than I do. Rwanda in 1994 and Srebrenica in 1995. They're sort of the major ones that maybe hit the headlines. And as for the Holodomor, after it was declared a genocide by the Ukrainian government in 2008, about 23 other states have now recognized the Holodomor as genocide. That's actually not a lot of states when you think about it, but it does include most, but not all of the democratic world. But the 1948 definition, as we see, is very broad. So in fact, there could be many other genocides that have not really commanded international attention, but nevertheless took place in the 20th century and are taking place in the 21st century, including the one that we're going to talk about. Now, because of the claims that Russia made against Ukraine at the beginning of the war, I will deal initially with Russia's claims against Ukraine and whether they actually have any credibility at all. And they made the claim against the Ukrainian government during the war in the Donbass between 2014 and 2022. But I think the real target is acting President Turchinov, who took power after the Maidan protests of 2013-14 on a temporary basis, and sent a Ukrainian army to regain the cities that have been taken over by separatist governments. And he called this an anti-terrorist operation. And one of the problems with that is that it didn't distinguish between the population of the Donbass and the militants who'd taken over most of the governments in those eastern Ukrainian regions. And the separatist forces in the first months of the war were led de facto by Igor Girkin, who called himself Strelkov, or sharpshooter, and eventually established his headquarters in the town of Slavyansk, which today is still in Ukrainian hands. And the NATO advance pushed Girkin out of Slavyansk. And at that time, he'd been abandoned by Vladimir Putin, who didn't sort of agree with his principles and didn't like his independence. And Girkin retreated to the city of Donetsk and set up his headquarters there. And as the Ukrainian forces advanced towards Donetsk, they bombed the city in their clashes with the forces of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic. And the civilians were trapped in the city, and they died from war, from gunfire, from shells, from artillery, from both sides. So they were simply trapped there. And Ukraine today is being blamed for the deaths of these citizens. But if you look inside these two republics, Donetsk People's Republic, Luhansk People's Republic, opinion polls have suggested that at no point has there been any desire on the part of the population to join Russia, to leave Ukraine and join Russia. What they've asked for quite frequently is for more autonomy, perhaps the right to sell more steel, more coal, etc., because this is the old industrial heartland of Ukraine. The two cities, Donetsk is most notable for coal production, but the whole region is notable for iron and steel as well. It's a region that's been in decline for some time, but nevertheless, it's still pretty important to the Ukrainian economy. And these regimes that have been set up have no basis for survival other than Russian support with material, with food, even with troops at significant times in 2014, 2015. At one point during this war, Ukraine cut off trade entirely with the separatist regions and cut off communications as well. And it did mean that some people were then cut off from their families in other parts of Ukraine and didn't have access to things like pensions. So the death toll in this region between 2014 and 2022 is estimated at about 14,000, almost 2 million refugees left. And these are the forgotten refugees, in my view. We talk about refugees today who are moving to Poland and different parts of Europe and North America. Nobody really paid much attention to these 1.8 million refugees that came from Donbass. They were more or less obliged either to cross the border east into Russia or to go to other parts of Ukraine. And the number of civilian deaths is estimated at about 3,400. So I think it's possible to criticize the Ukrainian approach. I think it's legitimate, but there was no intent or goal at any point by the government in Kiev to destroy civilians. It was a sort of side effect of the war. And in my view, it was a mistake to do that because they lost a lot of sympathy with the local population by shelling the city of Donetsk in particular from outside. But I don't think it was a war crime, let alone genocide. I put this up I got it from ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, and I think everybody who's watching Ukraine probably accesses this website, but it's just a reminder of what happened 1 year ago exactly, where the Russians entered Ukraine. This thrust from the north towards Kiev actually got to the outskirts of Kiev. The city of Kharkiv was bombed consistently for days and days. This region, the Donbass axis, as it's called, contains the separatist regions from 2014. And then this region in the south around Kherson, Zaporizhia, which was invaded from Crimea, annexed in late March 2014 as well. But if one looks at the Russian occupied regions of Ukraine, I think there is clear evidence of cultural genocide. And I'll describe why I think that is the case. First of all, Russians have removed orphans, but they've also removed school children generally in this region to Russia for re-education. That means they've been taken away from their families and sent to re-education camps. Some of those are for military training. In an article for the Integrated Child Development Services, Tatiana Fedosuk maintains that the real figure is not 6,000 as was reported in most media, but hundreds of thousands of children taken away from their families. And camps have been set up in Crimea, but also as far away as Siberia. And the children are being instructed in Russian patriotism, in the Russian language. And these are children who may never see their families again. They were simply, if you like, kidnapped by the local occupation regime, particularly in the southern region of Kherson. And I was interested to see that the Russian Presidential Commissioner of Children's Rights herself adopted a child from Mariupol in eastern Donbass, another region where this abduction of children has been taking place. We know less about that region because it's still very much under Russian occupation. But nevertheless, you can see a kind of pattern here of Russians trying to re-educate very young Ukrainian children. And this is at the very least a form of cultural genocide. But I think we can look at other examples as well. The names of the cities, the street signs, the names of towns, even in some cases, are being transferred to Russian usage, like they were back in the 19th century or 18th century, for example. And the Russian language is used exclusively, so the Ukrainian language is banned in areas that are fully under Russian control. It only really has consisted of two cities, two major cities. That's Mariupol, which is effectively destroyed. I mean, it's practically uninhabitable today. And the city of Kherson, which he occupied from the spring of 2022 to September, I believe it may have been a little bit later than that, in 2022 as well. But cities have also been attacked deliberately by artillery fire. And what this photograph shows is the former hospital in Mariupol, which was completely destroyed, a children's hospital. And this has been a deliberate campaign, I think, to destroy civilian structure in cities. In Kharkiv, it's also particularly notable. There's no other real reason why this city is the subject of so much bombing. Oddly enough, Kiev has not been targeted in the same kind of manner, I suspect, because the Russians intend to occupy the city themselves at some point and take over the government. I'd like to turn also to what the Russian leaders have been saying about Ukraine. And there's no question that ultra-nationalists are using genocidal rhetoric. One of them is the former president, Dmitry Medvedev, who's now deputy chair of the Russian Council, he's described Kiev leaders as, quote, cockroaches, and said that the Ukrainian state in its current form must be liquidated. I don't actually know what's happened to Dmitry Medvedev, because when he was in power, in that brief period between 2008 and 2012, when Putin couldn't stand for 3 consecutive terms, he was labeled as a moderate figure, someone who was going to liberalize Russia in some of the Western media. I suspect most of his posts on social media are written late at night, probably after a certain amount of drinking. They don't really make much sense otherwise, but he seems to have gone really quite crazy. But he's not the only one. And you see Moscow Duma deputy Andrei Medvedev, who said that to be Ukrainian, one does not even have to speak the Ukrainian language, which is also still being formed. Ukrainians are Russians who are being convinced that they are more special, more European, more racially pure, and more correct Russians. In other words, according to Mr. Medvedev, there is no such thing as a real Ukrainian. Ukrainians don't exist. It's an invented nation. And Vladimir Putin has, well, his views have evolved now, because at one point he was saying that the Bolshevik state founded Ukraine in 1917 to 21 period and created a Ukrainian republic eventually, and that is the real Ukraine. He doesn't see any Ukrainian history. But since then, he's actually blamed Austro-Hungary for founding Ukraine, because Galicia, where I believe Norman was born, or parents were born, I can't remember now. I think it was your parents, right? That part of Ukraine was part of Austria-Hungary. So from Putin as well, you hear frequently the same kind of language. And in his 2021 speech about Russia and Ukraine, he denied the existence of any Ukrainian state as well. The Institute for the Study of War has said that this rhetoric is openly exterminatory and dehumanizing, and calls for the conduct of a genocidal war against the Ukrainian state and its people, which notably has pervaded discourse in the highest levels of the Russian political mainstream. So this is dangerous language, I think, for the Russians to be using. Just a few words on massacres. First of all, when we talk about the Russian troops, we're talking about different things, different sorts of troops. Special troops, let's say those troops who've served prior to this war or prior to the expansion of this war in other areas, perhaps in Syria, for example, where Russia played a major role in the war to maintain the Syrian state. The Wagner Group has been the most prominent and has grown exponentially by recruiting prisoners. This is mainly Prigozhin's work. It's not the only private military company. There's a separate one under Shoigu. Shoigu has his own private military company. And so does Ramzan Kadyrov, the president of Chechnya. The Chechens there are operating as a private military company. And by and large, they have performed better than the regular army, although in the case of the Wagner Group, they've been sent on almost suicidal missions in the Donbass in recent times in trying to occupy the city of Bakhmut, and have been mowed down in wave after wave. And one report suggested they were losing about 800 troops in a single day at the height of this battle for Bakhmut. But there's also a rivalry between the regular army leaders and the Wagner chief Prigozhin, who was, I'm sure many of us know, was known as Putin's chef because of all his restaurants that he built in different parts of Russia. It's the areas that have been freed from Russian occupation that have been containing mass graves. That is, places like Bucha, Izium, and the Kharkiv region. We've heard indirectly about mass graves around Mariupol as well. But in the ones that have been found, mostly in the suburbs of Kiev, we've seen evidence of torture before the victims were executed. And these are civilians. These are not troops. These are men, women, children who are not in the armed forces, who are being tortured. Now, I've added this slide very recently because I've been talking over the past week with a former graduate student of mine who was living in Kherson until quite recently and managed to escape from there. He escaped while it was still under Russian occupation and made his way to Georgia. And then eventually from Georgia, he arrived in Toronto, and then he came to my city in Western Canada. And therefore, I think he's in a good position to make some observations, which he's done in a new article, which is as yet unpublished, but which he sent to me, and I've just made a few notes from it. He maintains in this article that the worst atrocities were carried out in the north and the Far East, that is, around Kiev and around Mariupol. But what he's suggesting is that different groups of Russian soldiers acted in diverse ways, and that the troops that entered Ukraine from the north after the military exercise with the Belarusian army were more seasoned, experienced troops than those that came in through the south into his region of Kherson. And he's described how in Kherson, for one thing, the troops didn't know they were entering a war. They'd started their military service, they were sent into the region. Many of them didn't have enough food, and they spent their time sort of looking around the local shops, stores, banks, etc. One of the banks was robbed by the Russian soldiers, but most often they went around looking for food because they weren't given enough supplies to stay for any length of time. And he said, this guy, I'll call him Alex, he said to me that at no time did he personally feel in any danger from this occupation. He was not in the city, he was in a village close to Kherson. But when he left by asking the soldiers to get on a bus and go to Georgia. So this is quite different from what is happening in the north and these dreadful atrocities we see in places like Bucha. He also commented that the Russian army traditions generally are much more brutal than, say, Western armies. I don't know the traditions in the Indian army, unfortunately, but the sort of hazing practices that are carried out in the Russian army make it almost like a form of imprisonment or concentration camp internment, because they're so difficult. And the brutal practices within the Russian army were honed perhaps in the war in Chechnya, or they may have been simply a tradition prior to that as well. But that's, I think, when I first read about them. So just as a general comment, the war crimes are less evident in the south around Kherson. And perhaps because of the, let's say, raw material in terms of troops that are being used in the south, that city was retaken by Ukraine quite easily in the latter part of 2022. I think in terms of the goals of Russia, which I'll turn to next, why is Russia in Ukraine? What is it trying to do? I'm not giving much credibility to the notion that Russia is in Ukraine because of NATO enlargement or NATO expansion, as Russia calls it. Russia paid no attention to that for about 18 years, really, after Poland became part of the NATO alliance, and the Baltic states too. But it came up in February 2022 quite suddenly as a casus belli. But I do see the following as likely Russian goals. That is the occupation of Kiev, which I think was the goal at the very beginning of the war, the removal of the Ukrainian government, and control of Ukrainian nuclear power stations. And we've seen that the defunct station of Chernobyl was taken over, but the active station at Zaporizhia was taken over and is still under the control of Russia. Then the installation of a pro-Russian regime or the outright annexation of Ukraine. And this entails the destruction of the Ukrainian state that existed for more than 30 years since August 1991, when independence was declared. Also, in the occupied areas, we see the elimination of adults and the re-education and removal of children. It's also quite clear that Russia intends or intended to eliminate leaders, political and cultural institutions of Ukraine, ATO veterans, and certainly former President Turchynov was on the list of the people to be arrested along with Zelensky, as was former President Petro Poroshenko, and civic activists. Anyone who was active during the Maidan protests, for example, would have been on that list as well. And occupation of as many areas as possible before the war ends. And I think the Donbass may be now the first priority, but I don't think it would be the last priority. I don't think Russia would be satiated by the control of the Donbass. They intend to control Zaporizhia, Kherson, Kharkiv, Kiev, and as far west as they can possibly get. So I paid no attention to the time, but I think if I give a conclusion now, it'd probably be about right in terms of time, yeah? So my conclusions, it's possible to make an argument that Ukraine committed some war crimes in the Donbass, as did the separatists, but not genocide. Russia, on the other hand, has committed cultural genocide, and Russia has committed what, by the 1948 definition that I quoted, are acts of genocide. So I kind of agree with Norman that it's too early to come to a firm conclusion about the nature of this and whether this can be applied more generally to Russian policy. But certainly there are individual acts of genocide that are taking place. And they're taking place on behalf of most of the Russian leadership. It's very hard to find any dissenting voices within the Russian leadership about the war in Ukraine. In fact, the only dissenting voice that I've seen, well, maybe two, maybe Prigozhin and Kadyrov, but they were dissenting because they didn't think the war was being fought properly and on a professional sort of basis. They wanted it expanded and much more harsh than under Putin. Russian media and social media focuses on the crimes of Ukraine almost exclusively, despite the fact that Russia has invaded and occupied Ukraine. And I've been surprised sometimes to see the number of Western scholars who are prepared to accept the line that's being propagated by Moscow, that this is an invasion to remove a far-right ultranationalist Nazi regime and government. In fact, there's no parliament of Ukraine that has contained more than 2% of far-right forces in the history of independent Ukraine. There's never been a president of Ukraine who could be characterized as a neo-Nazi or even as far-right. And that includes all of them from the very beginning. I also think it's the fact that Russia cannot destroy all Ukrainians. They've been fighting too hard. They're going to survive as a state. But it's attempting to destroy a national or ethnic group partially. And therefore, I would say overall, I would conclude that so far, this is typical historian really qualifying everything he says, but I think I would say on the whole, it is categorized as a genocide. So thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Marples. As we often forget that the crisis, some people tend to see the crisis has started from 2022, but it was the things had begun since 2014. Thanks for showing us the observations and the facts. So it was really a nice lecture. And now I would like to go to Ambassador Charles Crawford. He has told us that he is not an academic expert, though he has been writing a lot on Ukraine issue and has been quite vocal on this issue. So, and also he had served in Eastern Europe during his career in foreign policy, and had been the ambassador to Belgrade and Warsaw and Sarajevo. And he has seen during his experiences the genocide issues of Kosovo and Eastern Europe and those regions. So I would like to understand from Ambassador Crawford, how do you view this modern crisis and relating to the crisis that had occurred during Eastern Europe? And I would like to know your commentary as well on this topic. To you, Charles Crawford.
Crikey. Well, you know, my mind is not as well organized as our excellent professors, whose job it is to really get into this. And I've got nothing seriously to challenge in anything they said. They're very interesting, different bits of emphasis. I'm coming to this really wearing three small hats at the same time. I qualified as a barrister. I'm a lawyer. I did the law degree at Oxford and then did my bar exam. So technically I'm a barrister, even though I've never got up in court. So I did all that. And then I became a diplomat. So then I followed these issues, mainly in Central Europe, just the way it worked out. Because my first job was in Yugoslavia when it was still Yugoslavia, just after Tito died in 1980. And then, 3 or 4 years ago, I tried to do a degree in philosophy, a little master's in philosophy to pass the time, but I failed because it was too hard. But I'm interested in a way now, the sort of philosophy of what the professors are talking about. So I just like to say one or two things which just come at it from a different angle. What is it we're talking about when we talk about genocide or cultural genocide? What's it about? And I would say it's essentially about two things. It's about issues of scale, and it's about issues of identity. Because, even if I decide that I want to eliminate Indians in India, and I go and shoot 3 of them, that will probably not be counted as an act of genocide. It sort of just isn't big enough, if you can put it in that crude way. So for acts to count as genocide, they have to be quite big. On a horrible scale, really. And I think was it Norman mentioned Srebrenica, the massacre there. That was, people argue about the numbers, but it's sort of 6,000 to 9,000 people just more or less deliberately massacred. And that was in the context of the Bosnia War, which, people disagree whether you can even call that a civil war in Bosnia. Was it a civil war in Bosnia, even though Bosnians were fighting each other? Or was it a war of aggression by Serbia and Croatia coming in from the outside, or both? I mean, it's, the very terms themselves are in conflict here. I think one of the reasons we had the definition of genocide that we did goes back to the politics of what happened in the Second World War. And one of the most serious war crimes, which has never been admitted by the Moscow as a war crime, was the Katyn massacre, where something like 28,000 Polish officers of different shapes and sizes, but middle-class people who'd been captured when the Soviet Union attacked Poland, were murdered in just, one after the other. And I think there's a guy called Blokhin who was one of the chief executioners. You can look him up on Wikipedia. Basically what would happen is you'd bring in a person, they'd be shot in the back of the head, they'd hose down the room, take him out the back door, bring in the next one. And he would do this for about 6 weeks. That was his day. And then he'd go home and have soup. It's just extraordinary to think about the things that were happening. But I think the Soviet Union was very concerned when the definition of genocide was being drawn up in 1946 to make sure that its own ghastly crimes somehow were not categorized, or at least easily identifiable, and certainly not prosecutable. So there's issues of scale, and then underlying the whole thing is the issue of identity. You're trying to kill or destroy in part a group. Well, what's a group? Is it a cultural group? Is it a national group? Is it a language group? Is it a religious group, or some sort of combination of what a group is? And if any of you ever followed the Bosnian War, one of the leaders of the Bosnian Muslims was a guy called Ilija Izetbegović. He was famous in the war. He was the sort of figurehead of the, if you like, the Bosnian cause. But on his birth certificate, he was a Serb born in Belgrade. That's what it said on his birth certificate. He wasn't there as a Muslim. And this is something that completely baffled almost, I would say, 99.9% of people trying to analyze the Bosnian War, which is that in the Yugoslav communist constitutional changes in about 1974-75, you'd previously had Serbs and Croats and Macedonians and Montenegrins, but there was this category of people living in the Bosnian area who were sort of had been Turkishified, if I can put it this way, by the Ottoman Empire. So on their birth certificates, like Izetbegović, they had Serb or Croat or whatever it was, but in religious terms, they were Islamic and they felt different. They didn't feel Orthodox or Catholic. So the Yugoslavs decided to create a category called Muslim. And Muslim was an ethnic category in the sense that Croat, English, French, German is if you like, a category describing a specific people. So one of the things that baffled everyone in the Yugoslav conflict was trying to describe people. Because if you think about it, all Muslims with a capital M were sorry, let me get this right. Even I get confused now. All Muslims with a small m were Muslims with a big M, namely an ethnic category. Religious Muslims were all part of the Muslim ethnic category, but not all ethnic Muslims with a capital M were Muslims. Quite a lot of them were atheists. Quite a lot of them were communists. So when you said the Bosnian Muslims are under attack, and and what was the war crime at Srebrenica all about? Was it attacking Muslims with a capital M or Muslims with a small m? And you can imagine how lawyers have bickered over these things and still do. So trying to work out whether that last couple of slides from David was talking about Russians and Ukrainians, and he got into the issue of identity. And I was at a little conference with a few Ukrainian young leaders, young women mainly. And I said, part of the problem here is that Ukrainians and Russians are so close. And this one young lady gave me a very hard time over coffee, saying, how can you possibly say Ukrainians and Russians are so close? We're completely different, blah, 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 blah. And I said to her, well, what languages do you speak? She says, well, Ukrainian and Russian, of course, and English. So it seems to me that if I really was brought up almost bilingually between English and French, that sort of affects your worldview in some way. And it sort of means that English and French are close in some way that is different from England and Chinese people or French people and Brazilians. There's a certain, the language issues here are so subtle and complicated. And when you said, Sumava, look, it's great to be reminded that it's started in 2014. It started in 1514, or if you like, 1414 or 1314, because in that great space stretching over to the Urals, all the way from Normandy in France, it's basically a field. There's very little high ground all the way across for thousands of kilometers. And there aren't natural borders there where people can settle. So the language groups have mingled and separated and mingled and separated down the centuries. And how one gives expression to that has changed down the centuries as well. And I think it has to be said, loathsome as the Russian policies are, Ukrainians are busy taking down Russian roadsides and sort of cancelling Russian authors at the moment in parts of Ukraine. They're saying, look, it's too much, all this. We're not prepared to be seen as being as close to Russians as we have been in the past, and maybe in fact as we are. So I think some of the Russians would be pointing at this and saying, haha, look, cultural genocide going on here. Our Russian identity in Ukraine is seriously under attack. And I think that's probably actually pretty true. Anyway, so underlying I think part of the, when we're trying to work out why are Russian soldiers and why is all this happening? I think it's part of a bigger issue, frankly, which is that I don't think Putin accepts the legitimacy of the end of the Soviet Union. And Russia is not a country. This is a big point to remember, folks. Russia is what's left of the Tsarist Empire. And every other Russian that every other empire that entered the First World War, Ottoman Empire, British Empire, French Empire, German Empire, Portuguese Empire, Austria, I mentioned Austrian Empire, they've all gone. The only one that is still there is the Russian Empire. And I think Putin feels at the end of the Cold War, somehow Russia got cheated and great lumps of the Russian Empire, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, and the others fell off, Georgia, where Stalin was born. So I think part of it is his sort of sense that he wants to get as much of that back as he can before he dies, or at least set in motion a process so that the empire strikes back, as it were. I think this is what he's after, because otherwise it doesn't really make any sense. And I think he just clearly miscalculated. He thought he could get to Kiev, impose a government there. So even if it wasn't formally the whole country re-annexed into Russia, at least it would be very, very subservient. And that was clearly a miscalculation. So, he's in the mess he's in now. And I think even going beyond that, I think the issue of torture and the atrocities and the stuff which the professors have described so eloquently, I mean, for me, this comes down to a very big philosophical question, which is, what do you think a limit is? Is the rule of law something which, because it imposes limits on our behavior, a positive thing or a negative thing? And I always like to quote I don't know if anyone on this call recognizes this famous quote, the thing about chaos is it's fair. Does anyone know which philosopher said, the thing about chaos, it's fair? Deathly hush. Well, I'll tell you who it was. It was the Joker in the Batman movies. And the point he's saying really there, and it's a very, very subtle and brilliant movie line, is that rules are created by people who benefit from rules. And the rules of the Cold War and the rules of international order set up in 1945, and the sort of way the world is, the way the UN is, those rules shouldn't really apply anymore. And I think, if I can say so, talking to colleagues here from India, India is saying, hang on, we're the biggest country in the world, almost. Why the hell aren't we in the Security Council? Is this legitimate? And there's quite a good case to be made that it's not legitimate. But does that mean that therefore the rules that set it up should be challenged? And I think part of the Stalinism and communism is the idea that the sort of, if you like, bourgeois, middle class, liberal sort of Enlightenment rules under which we all operate, including in this podcast, are somehow completely sort of amusing but insignificant and irrelevant and can easily be swept aside. And so in a sense, the more violent you are, the more it shows that you do not accept these limits. And this is what the NKVD and this sort of form of terror is all about, is that whatever it is you can do to us, we will do worse to you. And this has been absolutely thematic point of certainly of Soviet communism. But I think latterly, as someone was saying, Putin has sort of taken that up. He's retreating into Stalinist sort of rhetoric and nomenclature and sort of, I don't know, psychology almost, because he's almost got nowhere else to go. He's been such a mess. He might as well go there. There's a famous line, is it in Macbeth, where, Macbeth says, I'm so far into the river of blood, I might as well keep moving rather than go back to the shore and clean myself off. Putin is in that situation now. He sort of almost has to keep going, because how else does he justify all this? But one of the things he wants to do by keeping going is to challenge every form of legitimacy. He's like ISIS. ISIS was saying, never mind international law, we want a caliphate, and we'll just burn people alive on YouTube and do whatever the hell we like to prove that, to establish it. And Putin is sort of coming along with that, but dressing himself up in the international language of international law. And I was invited today by an Arab language competitor to Al Jazeera. I won't say who it was, but they want to talk about, wanted me to talk about the unlawful NATO attack on Yugoslavia, because that's coming up. And I've just sent an email to them saying, well, I've noticed on your channel, you never talk about the unlawful Russian attack on Ukraine, because the whole website there, the whole TV channel is basically run by the Syrian leadership and the Russians and various other extremists. So it's just a propaganda channel. So I've said I don't want to appear on your stupid program because the whole philosophical basis of it is flawed. So I think one of the things to bear in mind in all this is that part of the point is denying limits. And I would just finish off, I think, by saying that we've got to be careful when, I include myself in this, and I think our two professors here who've spoken would say, global opinion says this, global opinion says that. Well, last night at the UN, global opinion as represented by China and India, which is probably more than almost everyone else combined, didn't support the resolution condemning the Russian attack on Ukraine. They always abstain and find sort of eccentric and almost frankly dishonest reasons for doing that. So as far as I'm concerned, I'd like to say here it's disappointing that India, can't bring itself to criticize Russia in this way when Russia's the explicit act of aggression. You can argue about the scale of genocide and whether taking children away is genocide. Has it happened on a big enough level, or changing street signs or torturing people as a genocide? But the absolute unequivocal fact is that this is an act of aggression. It's a war crime under international law, and countries like India, I think, should be jolly well saying so. And for them to be abstaining simply shows how powerful the Russian idea is, that the rules themselves, the legitimacy of the international order, is something that can be qualified and undermined and just treated as a sort of Western plot. This sort of language is just out there, and it's actually quite effective, let's be honest. Right, I will shut up.
Yeah, it was a nice commentary given by Charles. So I would like to go for the discussion, and I would also like to know, if our professors would like to comment or say something or discuss. This is an open panel, so yeah.
One thing I just wanted, I made a list of things to say and I just missed one. You can argue about all this till you're blue in the face, but if you want to prosecute people for these things in a way which is respectable, it costs a hell of a lot of money. The tribunal for the former Yugoslavia has cost something like $2.5 billion to prosecute 160 people. And part of the problem with it, and here I'm wearing my legal hat, as it were, is that genocide is a strange crime because you have to prove two things. You have to prove the intention to kill or do the damage, and you have to prove the intention, as well as doing the killing, to hurt or destroy the group. So proving these things up the chain of command and getting away from whatever stupid horrors individual soldiers have committed is extremely difficult. And even with all the intelligence evidence and everything else you can throw at it, it's very, very hard to get convictions, as the Yugoslav tribunal has shown. And that's one reason it's been so expensive, is because they didn't want to do what happened at Nuremberg, where there were actually dozens of war crimes trials, some of which were over in a matter of hours almost, and people were just executed. That was seen as summary justice. The Nuremberg main trial itself was a serious effort, but there were lots of other trials associated with Nazi war criminals where people were rounded up and pretty much shot on the spot. So to get away from that form of justice, you've ended up in this almost sort of hyper expensive form of injustice, and bringing people to trial. There'll be no war crimes for, I can't imagine a context in which any Russian government, even if Putin was overthrown tomorrow and replaced by the most liberal Russians anyone could find, would accept Russian leaders being sent off to some international tribunal, like Milosevic was, to face war crimes charges. So in a sense, the discussion really is academic.
Yeah, and also ICTY, when it was the case of Yugoslavia, I think world was a bit luckier, because when we see the incidents like Khmer Rouge or the Chile, which were more devastating, and it was a case of history. Last day we were also discussing this with Ben Kiernan, and so we were discussing even the half of the perpetrators are not even prosecuted there, and even for Chile, we know Augusto Pinochet was someone cruel, a dictator and everything, but even today Chile struggles to change its draconian laws, and also even its main mastermind didn't get what the survivors or the people didn't get justice, as half of the perpetrators are not caught. So this process is really, really difficult. Like I have read Professor Naimark's writings, and I hope Professor Marples would also agree to that. So yeah. Professor, you're muted.
So you want me to comment on that issue? Is that right?
Yes, yes, definitely.
Well, let me just say I respectfully disagree with Ambassador Crawford about the trials in Bosnia. Not that they didn't cost them that much money, but are they worth something? And I mean, I would, you know, let's just talk about this a little bit. The fact that Milosevic, I mean, obviously he was not convicted. He died before conviction. It took a long time to get him to trial. It was, you know, there were a lot of things that went wrong in the Bosnian tribunal, but on balance, I would suggest that even if it cost God knows how many billions, it was worth it. Because in the memory, in the human memory, in history, Milosevic is known, you know, as a genocidaire. And just to call him a genocidaire is different than to put him on trial for it and to present the evidence for it. So, you know, I have students, for example, who work on the Bosnian War. And I tell them, go to these the materials of those trials are some of the richest materials in the world on the war in Bosnia. I mean, you get all kinds of amazing stuff, you know, from those trials, expert witnesses and specialized communications and government documents and all kinds of things. So, you know, if you just think about that, let's just talk about that trial on balance. You know, to get Mladic and Karadzic and Milosevic for genocide in Bosnia strikes me as a hugely important and positive thing in the history of, first of all, the 1990s, but of the end of the 20th century, and also in the history of kind of human rights thinking. The second thing I would respectfully disagree with is that if indeed you got Russian liberals, I mean, the question is, would you get Russian liberals in charge of Russia? But if you did get Russian liberals in charge of Russia, you could bet your boots they would send Putin as soon as they could on the rails to The Hague. I mean, there are, as you probably know, and again, we have hundreds of thousands of Russian immigrants, right? I don't know how many of them can be considered, in quotes, Russian liberals. But let's say, you know, the people I know, the people who have fled for their lives and are fighting against the Putin regime from abroad, you know, are very serious people, very liberal-minded, very Western, you know, thinking about Western norms of law and things like that. I mean, I don't want to get into you know, an argument about international norms and law and that kind of thing, but you know, there are plenty of Russians who think just like you and I do about this situation and are ready, you know, to stop this war if they can. Problem is they're stuck in a hard place, one that I wouldn't want to be. Let me just leave it at that.
Can I just quickly just say, listen, I don't want to give the impression I thought the ICTY was a bad thing. I did my bit, I can tell you, to get, I did more than my bit to get Milosevic and the rest of them physically transferred to The Hague. I mean, I was, you know, supporting that. In fact, I was saying what's ludicrous is that we have a policy for The Hague and we're not actually implementing it. This is back in 1996. No, I mean, all I'm saying is that it's very, very expensive and slow. And even under optimum conditions, you know, it's very, very hard to get these convictions. And as for the second point, I think you know, I've lived in these countries, and I've lived in lots of different countries. And I think as well as, you know, even the Serbian liberals, when I was there, who wanted Milosevic to go to The Hague, they felt a bit uneasy about Serbia itself being condemned for war crimes. And this was a big issue. Bosnia tried to sue Serbia for damages. And they said, look, there may have been individual criminals, but it wasn't the sort of Serbian essence that did all these things. It was a bunch of gangs.
It didn't work. It didn't work.
No, but handing over people, if it looks like it's going to be seen as a way of punishing Russia, for example, would be very difficult, not because they wouldn't want to do it, but because they wouldn't want to end up like Djindjic, who sent Milosevic to The Hague and got assassinated. You know, there are certain things that you just can't do because in the end, you won't have enough public opinion with you, even if you are in the right. But anyway, be all that as it may, it sort of, in a sense, is sort of beside the point. I just feel that the power of the crime itself is clearly a massive thing, and there's absolutely no doubt that in this case Russia is well on the spectrum of committing these crimes. There's no doubt about it. What, if anything, will happen about it? And in a way, why it's perversely difficult to get so many sensible countries like South Africa or India to agree with this proposition, why precisely Russian propaganda and lies and bullying and corruption in skewing the international debate is so powerful is an interesting question.
I think also we have to take into account the makeup of the UN Security Council, which is basically the victors of the Second World War. I mean, the thing is, it's not changed, and it never anticipated that one of the main violators would be a member of that council. So it may raise questions of how such world international problems can be resolved if the UN isn't effectively working at all. I mean, it's pretty well useless in this struggle. Maybe in addition to Russia, China is also a member of the council and might also pose problems. So, you know, I've often thought maybe we should rotate the members of that council between major nations. I mean, maybe you would have to put a minimum limit of population to do that. But, you know, why shouldn't India be on that Security Council? There's no logic to it. And there are other potential states like Brazil, for example, or even South Africa, you know, that you would think could logically play a role in bringing conflicts to an end. And I've thought about this for some time, about whether, you know, United States might take a different attitude toward China. I mean, China is seen, I believe, you know, from what I've read, as a hostile power in Washington right now. It's not perceived in any different kind of way. But how are you going to get, you know, these kind of conflicts to end? You know, whether or not you bring people to trial for genocide, you know, just ending the conflict is surely the first step. And how are you going to do that if China consistently backs Russia and is regarded by the United States as a hostile power? So I don't know. I think there is room for some sort of alternative structure that can address problems arising from major world conflicts, or the UN has to be revamped, one or the other.
The beauty of the situation is that the people who need to agree the revamping have a veto on whether the UN is revamped. So that's why it never happens, because there's literally no chance that even France and perhaps even the UK would be happy to change it in a way that meant that their sort of status, as it were, in the world was diminished, and certainly America and Russia and China won't. So I mean, it's one of these things, it's just stuck. And this is why I think, you know, when you're talking about all these issues, you know, there's the sort of logic of them. There's the horrible things happening on the ground. There's the legal situation, but there is, if you like, the geopolitical reality in which they're happening and the enthusiasm with which some countries will take up the cause and others won't. And it's no coincidence that China and India are both taking the position they are, because I think they're, for different reasons, they think if the Russians are stupid enough to attack the West, this will probably make the West a bit weaker. And so why shouldn't we be happy with that? You know, because we're sick of the West lecturing us. So I think the West comes to it, if you can call us the West, we come to it with I wouldn't say with dirty hands, but with sort of sticky hands. This is the trouble. And people out there are just saying, well, maybe it's time for a change of some sort. And even if we don't like what Russia's doing in Ukraine, it may be a catalyst for some sort of wider collapse of Western power. I don't know. It's hard to say. What does everyone else think who's not one of these clever boffins who's spoken so far?
Like one thing I would like to add, like when it comes to the definition of the genocide, like itself, it is very problematic. Like once given by the UN Genocide Convention and the one which scholars follow. So this is very problematic. And like further, like I have read this even in the book by Professor Naimark, Genocides of World History, like where he has also mentioned the thing about the story of Raphael Lemkin, and also Professor Marples today mentioned the case of Raphael Lemkin, that today, even today, like the convention does not categorically recognize race, culture, and political crimes as part of genocide. And I wanted to ask this to Professor Naimark and Marples: is it possible to have a universal definition of genocide, and why is this so problematic?
So let me try to put a little context into the answer to that question, at least as far as I'm concerned. As you know from reading that book, that I think the genocide is part of human history. It's been with us from the very beginning, and that the developments in international law and human rights law that happened after the First World War, creates a new set of thinking about these kinds of, let me just use the general term atrocity crime, to include war crimes and crimes against humanity, and war of aggression and genocide. And Raphael Lemkin, as you know, was a Polish Jewish lawyer who in the 1920s, I mean, we're not talking now post-World War II, in the 1920s already, as a result of the Armenian genocide. And also there was a terrible genocide of Syriac Christians in Iraq and Eastern Turkey in the beginning of the 1930s, came up with essentially a definition of genocide. I mean, I won't go into details. I've written about this if people are interested, which he presented to a group of international lawyers attached to the League of Nations. So this is not something that, just comes out of the Second World War. It comes out of a kind of change in how people are thinking about international norms having to do with mass killing, really, mostly. And Lemkin, as you know, then ends up in the United States. He writes this famous book on the Axis occupation of Europe, and coins the term genocide even before there is a genocide convention. And he's a kind of lobbyist at Nuremberg. He tries to get the Nuremberg folks to pay attention to, in 46, to pay attention to the genocide concept, and they don't. They're not really interested in it. I mean, they show pictures, they show clips of liberated concentration camps as a way to denounce Nazis, but they don't really care about the fact that, the Nazis attacked peoples as a whole. And as the ambassador mentioned, they also refused to consider the Katyn massacre, which, by the way, was 22,000. And at the time, they actually thought it was 2,000 or 2,000 or 3,000. They didn't know how many Polish officers had actually been killed until the Soviets turned over the documents in 1988 or 89 to the Americans and to the Poles, first of all. Anyway, and when the convention comes, there's a kind of history of the convention. There are all these committees, people meet, there are arguments, and everybody was desperate to have it confirmed as unanimous. And the only way to get that done unanimously was to make concessions to various people. And the political and social groups that were initially included in Lemkin's definition were put to the side. And as David mentioned, cultural genocide, which was also part of Lemkin's conception of genocide, was also put to the side. And therefore, this very narrow definition, which, as the ambassador correctly identified, comes out of World War II. Who killed whom in World War II? Well, it was ethnic, religious, racial groups, or supposedly racial groups, came out of that. So, the Genocide Convention then, in my view, serves as a good basis for our own definitions of genocide. But they've evolved, and they've evolved in the courts. They've evolved in the international courts. They've evolved in the Bosnian court, the ICTY and the ICTR, in Rwanda, in that court. They've evolved in other cases. Again, I mentioned we now think of rape as part of mass rape, as part of genocide. That came out of, Bosnia and Rwanda especially. And so there's an evolving definition of genocide. And, I've made an argument when you think historically about genocide that, political and social groups should be included. But I don't think necessarily international legal norms are going to pay any attention to what a few historians are arguing in, back and forth in genocide studies. I mean, we can say what we want, and we do say what we want, which is important. And people will say the damnedest things, as David said, about some things. But that's the idea of academia, is to explore ideas and to think about the past and the present in new and different ways. But my view is that the combination of the Genocide Convention plus the legal, the international legal precedents that have evolved since, form a kind of good basis for thinking about genocide. So when we think about what's going on, let's say today in Ukraine, I think you use those two things together. You use the legal precedents, you use the Genocide Convention, and you use common sense, to try to figure out as best you can whether the Russians are essentially, trying to eliminate the Ukrainians as a nation. There's a lot of evidence that they are. And if they are, then that's genocide, right? And one fine day, as I say, I won't see it, but one fine day, they may be held responsible for what they're doing.
Can I just pick up, Sumava, a point made in the chat by, is it Adarsh Tripathi? Particularly the second point he's made here, which is he's saying that, he's making the point, which I was saying, that there have been moves by Ukrainians to downgrade the Russian language and so on and so on. What about that? And then he goes on to say, NATO enlargement is obviously responsible for the war. That's the sense of what he's saying there. I think those are, if you like, Moscow arguments. And I think when you listen to Moscow arguments, you've got to remember that Moscow arguments are dishonest. Now, that's not to say that all Western arguments are honest, but these particular ones are deeply dishonest. And Moscow complains about the alleged, moves against the Ukrainian language, against the Russian language in Ukraine. But imagine if Russia was saying, look, Ukraine, look at the people, let's open the archives and look at the Ukrainian intellectuals who were murdered in the 1930s for speaking Ukraine. Let's look at the programs Russia and Moscow brought in under Stalin to eliminate the Ukrainian language in schools in Ukraine back in the 1930s. We officially apologize for that. And we are let's try and work out a way of getting these language things, honest and respectable. But of course, the Russians don't do that. They never talk about their own persecution of the Ukrainian people in that sense. And the history of this is really, really big and massive. And for them to sort of nitpick now, it just shows that they're not coming to it in good faith. Now, the problem with the diplomatic issue of whether NATO is responsible for this mess. What happened when the Soviet Union broke up was a lot of new countries were created. And this is a big point for people to remember. Ukraine has been a UN member state longer than Russia, because the Russians insisted that Ukraine join the UN as a member state itself, even though it was part of the USSR. So Ukraine has been a member of the UN as an independent state going right back to 1946. When Russia broke up, Ukraine's independence, so to speak, was reinforced because it wasn't part of the Soviet Union anymore, and all these other countries emerged. But the repressive Stalinist apparatus, which had kept these countries under Moscow's control violently for the previous 50, 60, 70, 80, whatever it was, 100 years, was still there. And one of the reasons, and I was told this by a top Polish politician, he said, look, you've got to understand that one of the key reasons Poland joined NATO was it was the only way to get the Russian military intelligence operation out of Poland, because it was corrupting Polish political life. The Russian military intelligence is a force unto itself. It has its own budget for running intelligence operations, running agents, and so on. And so the own part of countries wanting to join NATO is to stop Russian subversion in those countries. And that is a reasonable thing for them to want to do. And it's reasonable for NATO to say, if you want to stop Russian subversion, which is threatening your whole identity, then it's reasonable for you to join NATO. That actually isn't a bad policy for us to have. And so then to say that because Ukraine wanted to join NATO, therefore NATO is responsible for Russian bombing hospitals in Ukraine and killing people riding bicycles going to the shop, this is an absurd argument, and it really shouldn't be accepted, I think.
We are almost at the end of the session, and I would like to have Professor Marples' argument, and then we will wrap up, obviously. Yes, Professor Marples. Yes, you were saying something.
Yeah, I mean, I would just like to add to what Ambassador Crawford just said. I mean, there are other examples as well, and one that I deal with personally a lot is Belarus. And there you've got a state where the national language has basically been regarded as an opposition language for many years, and brutally suppressed, first of all, by the Soviet state, and then under the long presidency of Lukashenko. And you have a situation there where Russian military just roam around. They operated a lot of their attacks on Ukraine from Belarusian territory. They have 2 military bases there. They're trying to open an air base. Nobody says a word about this, but it's happening now. And, you know, the situation with these languages, Belarusian, Ukrainian, and others, has been dire for a long time. And I think Putin associates the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, with his Russian Federation. I don't see any break there. I mean, it's the same state. The embassy of the USSR became the embassy of the Russian Federation, and all the buildings transferred from the Soviet Union to Russia. These new nations never got anything. So there's definitely a train of thought here that identifies Putin with Stalin, say, or with Peter the Great, whoever he chooses. So when you're talking about Russia, you are talking about these same things that happened in the past as well. And I think we have to remember what's happened to Ukraine. Yes, they do make mistakes. Maybe they do stupid things like ban the use of Russian in Kiev-Mohyla University was one I heard last week, for example. It's a silly move, right? It doesn't help, because many of the people who supported Maidan and previous uprisings in Ukraine were Russian speakers. There's no need to discriminate against them, but I can understand why. But this is on a minor scale compared to what Russia is doing today in Ukraine and other states of the former Soviet Union. So that I would like to just comment there. End it there.
Exactly. Like, we do not exactly know that what is a thing, but we cannot support the war and invasion, whoever the party, whoever the country, or whoever it is. So I hope, like, I would like to thank all our speakers, as Professor Norman Naimark, Professor David Marples, as well as Ambassador Charles Crawford, for joining us today. And I started our session with hopes, and I would end with hope as well, because this is the only thing which we as human beings can think of now, because we do not know what are the situations currently in Ukraine, but we always hope for the best. And we hope that someday this war would be ending, and when genocide and when these commissions would be set up, and when there would be ground reports to be arranged, we hope the numbers are not what we today speculated or what we thought today are obviously not the not what we fear or assume. I hope that that genocide is the, as we always say, that never again, that world reaches to a stage that it is really are not never again, but we have really long way to go for that, obviously. Thank you so much, professors, and thank you so much, Ambassador Crawford, for joining us today.
You're very welcome.